When that three-star general walked into the courtroom and called me by my rank, everything they built on lies came crashing down. The rain hammered against the windshield of my rental car as I pulled up to the Blackwood Manor for the first time in 8 years. The Gothic stone facade loomed against the storm clouds, exactly as imposing as I remembered from my childhood nightmares. Gargoyles perched on the corners like silent sentinels, their stone eyes watching every approach. The circular driveway was already crowded with luxury vehicles, Mercedes, BMWs, a Bentley that could only belong to Uncle Richard. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, adjusting my army dress blues in the rearview mirror. The silver bars on my collar caught the dim light. First Lieutenant Sarah Blackwood, 25 years old, 2 tours in Afghanistan, recipient of the Bronze Star, and apparently still the family disappointment. I'd driven 12 hours straight from Fort Campbell after receiving the terse phone call. "Grandfather's funeral is tomorrow. Don't embarrass us." Click. That was it. No condolences, no explanation of why I'd been left out of every conversation about his declining health over the past year. No mention of the fact that I'd been requesting leave to visit him for months, only to be told by Victoria's assistant that Mr. Blackwood wasn't receiving visitors. Just a demand wrapped in the same cold authority that had driven me to enlist the day I turned 18. The silence had been deafening these past 8 years. Not a single call when I graduated officer candidate school. Nothing when I was deployed to Kandahar. Radio silence when shrapnel from an IED left me in a field hospital for 3 weeks, or when I was awarded the Bronze Star for leading my unit through an ambush that should have killed us all. The only communication had been legal documents, trust paperwork that needed my signature, tax forms, business-related items that reminded me I was technically still a Blackwood, even if they wished I wasn't. But grandfather, he'd been different. Even when the rest of the family had written me off as a rebellious teenager playing soldier, he'd understood. Colonel Harrison Blackwood, Bronze Star, Silver Star, Purple Heart with 2 clusters. He'd served in Vietnam when it wasn't popular, came home to build Blackwood Industries from a small defense contracting company into a multinational corporation worth over $2 billion. He was the only one who'd ever looked at my enlistment as anything other than an act of defiance. The last time I'd seen him was during my leave before my second deployment. He'd been frailer then, but his eyes were still sharp, still seeing things others missed. "You're more like your father than they want to admit," he'd told me over coffee in his study, the room lined with military memorabilia and business awards. "That's why they're afraid of you, sweetheart. You remind them of what honor looks like." Now he was gone, and I was about to face the vultures. The manor's front door opened before I could knock. My stepmother Victoria stood in the doorway, her platinum hair pulled into a perfect chignon, diamonds glittering at her throat like armor. She'd married my grandfather when I was 12, 3 years after my grandmother's passing, and had spent every day since trying to erase any trace of the family that came before her. She looked me up and down with the same expression she'd worn when I was 17, and tracking mud through her pristine foyer. "Sarah," she said, her voice clipped with that practiced Connecticut accent that never quite masked her origins, "I didn't think you'd actually come." "You mean you hoped I wouldn't?" I replied, stepping past her into the marble-floored entryway. The smell hit me immediately. Expensive perfume, polished wood, funeral flowers, and something else. Fear, maybe, or guilt. The foyer had been redecorated since my last visit. Everything was white and gold now, sterile and gleaming. Gone were the rich burgundies and deep browns that grandmother had chosen, the colors that had made this place feel warm despite its size. This looked like a museum exhibit, How the Wealthy Live. My half-brother Marcus emerged from the library, crystal tumbler already in hand despite it being barely noon. At 32, he'd perfected the art of looking important while doing nothing. MBA from Wharton, corner office at Blackwood Industries, salary that could feed a small country and about as much backbone as a jellyfish. His eyes flicked over my uniform with barely concealed irritation. "Playing dress-up, little sister?" he smirked, swirling his whiskey. "This is a funeral, not a recruitment poster." I ignored him, scanning the familiar space. The grand staircase curved upward like a spine, but the family portraits lining the walls had been rearranged. Generations of Blackwoods stared down at me with the same cold disapproval I'd grown up under, but something was wrong. Someone was missing. "Where's Dad's portrait?" I asked, my voice steady despite the ice forming in my chest. Victoria's smile was sharp as glass. "We redecorated. It didn't fit the new aesthetic." Of course they had. 8 years wasn't enough to erase me from this family. They'd needed to erase him too. Captain Michael Blackwood, Marine Corps, killed in action in Iraq when I was 16. The war hero's son who disappointed his father by dying before he could take over the family business. The man whose memory had apparently become inconvenient to the new regime. "You removed a portrait of a fallen Marine," I said, and something in my tone made Marcus shift uncomfortably. "From his own father's house." "Now, Sarah," Victoria began. "That's Lieutenant Blackwood," I corrected quietly, "and you will address my father by his rank when you speak of him." A tense silence filled the marble space. In the Army, you learn that respect isn't given, it's commanded, and right now, I was commanding it. My younger half-sister Chloe descended the stairs, 23, and polished to perfection in designer black. She'd always been the golden child, the one who stayed, who played by their rules, who studied art history at Vassar, and dated the right boys from the right families. But she'd also been 7 when I left, and I'd spent more nights reading her bedtime stories than Victoria ever had. She gave me a small wave, but something in her eyes looked almost apologetic. "Hi, Sarah. I'm glad you came." At least one person in this house still had a functioning conscience. Uncle Richard appeared from the sitting room, all 300 pounds of him stuffed into a black suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. He'd been Grandfather's business partner for 30 years, though partner was generous. He'd mostly been the glad-handing face of the company while Grandfather did the actual work. His wife Diane trailed behind him, dripping in pearls and looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. "Sarah, my dear," Richard boomed, arms outstretched. "Look at you. All grown up and official looking." I allowed the embrace because refusing would cause more drama than I wanted to deal with, but I noticed he didn't mention my rank or my service. To him, I was still just playing dress-up. "Uncle Richard, Aunt Diane." I nodded to both of them. "I'm sorry for our loss." "Yes, well," Richard cleared his throat. "Harrison lived a full life, built quite a legacy." "That he did," Marcus said, and there was something in his tone that made my antenna go up. Something smug and satisfied. "Speaking of which, we should probably discuss logistics." "Logistics?" I asked. Victoria waved her hand dismissively. "Business matters, dear. Nothing you need to concern yourself with." The condescension in her voice was like nails on a chalkboard, but I'd learned patience in the military. You don't always get to react to every insult, every slight. Sometimes you have to wait for the right moment to strike back. "I'm sure Grandfather's affairs are quite complex," I said mildly. "Running a company like Blackwood Industries requires careful planning." "Oh, the company will be fine," Marcus said, that same smugness creeping into his voice. "All the important decisions have already been made." There it was again. That certainty, that satisfaction, like they knew something I didn't. The afternoon passed in a blur of forced conversations and fake condolences. Family friends, business associates, politicians, they all came to pay their respects to Colonel Harrison Blackwood. I stood in the corner, mostly ignored, watching the performance. Everyone spoke of Grandfather's legacy, his vision, his incredible business acumen. But I noticed something else. The way people looked at Marcus and Victoria. Like they were already in charge, like the transition of power had already happened. Every time someone approached me, the conversation was brief and awkward. "You must be proud of your grandfather," they'd say. "Such a shame you couldn't be here more often." The implication was clear. I was the absent granddaughter, the one who'd chosen the military over family, who'd missed out on the important moments. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd tried. I'd tried to come home for holidays, only to be told the family was traveling. I'd tried to visit during leave, only to be informed that Grandfather was too busy with business. I'd tried to maintain relationships, but every attempt had been quietly sabotaged by Victoria and her allies. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself gravitating toward Grandfather's study. The door was closed, but it wasn't locked. I slipped inside, needing a moment away from the performance downstairs. The room was exactly as I remembered it. Dark wood paneling, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, the massive mahogany desk where grandfather had built his empire. Military decorations filled one wall, his own medals alongside those of family members who'd served going back 3 generations. My father's Purple Heart was there, along with his Silver Star. My Bronze Star sat beside them, though I'd never asked for it to be displayed. On the desk was a framed photo I hadn't seen before, grandfather and me at my commissioning ceremony. I was 22, fresh out of OCS, practically glowing with pride as he pinned the gold bars on my uniform. I'd been so surprised when he'd shown up. Victoria had told me he was too ill to travel. But there he was, ramrod straight in his dress uniform, every inch the Marine Colonel, even at 78 years old. He was so proud of you that day. I turned to find Chloe in the doorway, her expression soft and sad. Was he? I asked, setting the photo down carefully. Are you kidding? He talked about it for months. Showed that picture to anyone who'd stand still long enough. She stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. Sarah, there's something you should know. Chloe? Victoria's voice cut through the air like a whip. What are you doing in there? Chloe's face went pale. Nothing, Mother. I was just... Come downstairs, now. Victoria appeared in the doorway, her eyes flashing between Chloe and me. And Sarah, I'd prefer if you didn't go through your grandfather's things. The study is off limits until after the will reading. I wasn't going through anything, I said calmly. I was paying my respects. Of course you were. Her tone suggested she believed otherwise. Well, you've paid them. Now please join the others downstairs. I looked at Chloe, who was staring at the floor, then back at Victoria. There was definitely something going on here, something I wasn't supposed to know about. Of course, I said, following them out, but I noticed Victoria lock the study door behind us, pocketing the key. The evening progressed with more of the same. Dinner was served in the formal dining room, 12 courses of Victoria's pretentious nouvelle cuisine that left everyone hungry. I sat between a Supreme Court justice and a defense contractor, making polite conversation about military procurement and foreign policy. At least these topics I could handle with some authority, but throughout the meal I kept catching fragments of whispered conversations. Transition planning. Board meeting next week. Everything's been arranged. And always, that same smug certainty from Marcus and Victoria. After dinner, people began to leave. Handshakes, air kisses, promises to get together soon that everyone knew were lies. I helped clear glasses and straighten chairs, partly out of habit, and partly because I needed something to do with my hands. You don't have to do that, Diane said, watching me stack plates. The catering staff will handle it. I don't mind, I replied. In the Army, we clean up after ourselves. She smiled, and for a moment it seemed genuine. Your grandfather talked about you all the time, you know. He had newspaper clippings from when you received your Bronze Star, articles about your unit's missions. He kept them in his desk drawer. Something warm spread through my chest. He did? Oh, yes. Richard used to tease him about it, said he was turning into a scrapbook grandmother. Her expression grew more serious. He missed you terribly, Sarah. I think he regretted, well, the way things went when you left. Before I could respond, Marcus appeared beside us. Aunt Diane, Uncle Richard is looking for you. She patted my arm once and moved away, but not before shooting Marcus a look that could have frozen hell. Quite the soldier, Marcus said once she was gone. I'm sure the Army appreciates your dedication to cleanliness. Is there something you want to say to me, Marcus? He studied me for a moment, swirling the last of his whiskey. Just wondering how long you're planning to stay. Why, are you worried about something? His laugh was forced. Worried? About what? You're here for a funeral, not a family reunion. Good thing, I said, since this doesn't feel much like family. Something flickered across his face. Anger, maybe, or fear. You made your choice 8 years ago, Sarah. You can't just show up now and expect things to be different. Different how? But he was already walking away, leaving me with more questions than answers. Later that night, I lay in my childhood bedroom, The one-room Victoria hadn't completely redecorated, though she'd removed most of my personal belongings. The furniture was the same. Twin bed with the pink comforter I'd hated even as a kid, the white desk where I'd done homework, the bookshelf still half filled with novels and history textbooks. But the walls were bare now. Gone were my track and field ribbons, my academic awards, the photos of friends. Gone was the acceptance letter to West Point that I'd pinned up with such pride, only to find out a week later that my college fund had mysteriously disappeared, forcing me to enlist instead of pursuing the academy. I'd never questioned it at the time. Grandfather had explained that the market had been bad, that some investments hadn't panned out. I'd been disappointed but not devastated. The Army had given me purpose, had made me stronger than any academy could have. But now, lying in the dark, I wondered if there was more to that story. My phone buzzed with a text from my platoon sergeant back at Campbell. "Sorry for your loss, LT. Take care of yourself." Then another from my best friend Jessica, whom I'd served with in Afghanistan. "Thinking of you, call if you need to talk." And several more from soldiers I'd served with, officers I'd trained with, friends I'd made in the military. People who actually knew me, who respected me, who understood what service meant. The contrast was stark. 8 years in the Army had given me a family of choice. Brothers and sisters who'd have my back in any firefight, who trusted me with their lives, who saw me as a leader worth following. And here, in the house where I'd grown up, I was still the inconvenient reminder of a son they'd rather forget. Thunder rumbled outside and lightning illuminated the room for a brief moment. In that flash, I thought I saw something, a figure in the garden below my window, but when I looked again, there was nothing. I was being paranoid. The stress of being back here, the strange undercurrents I kept sensing, the way everyone seemed to be waiting for something, it was getting to me. But as I finally drifted off to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow's funeral was just the opening act. The real show was yet to come. And somewhere in the darkness of Blackwood Manor, secrets waited to be uncovered. The morning of Grandfather's funeral dawned gray and cold, fitting for a man who'd spent his life building walls around his emotions. I stood at my bedroom window, watching the catering trucks arrive, and the funeral home staff transform the manor's grounds into something resembling a military ceremony. At least they'd gotten that part right. I'd been awake since 0400, unable to sleep. So I'd done what any good soldier does with nervous energy. I'd gone for a run. 8 miles through the Virginia countryside, past horse farms and estates that probably cost more than most people would see in a lifetime. The physical exertion had helped clear my head, but it hadn't erased the growing certainty that something was fundamentally wrong in this house. Now, as I adjusted my dress blues one final time, I caught my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was nothing like the angry teenager who'd left this place. She was harder, more focused, with lines around her eyes that came from squinting into Afghan sun and laughter shared with soldiers who'd become family. The Bronze Star ribbon on her chest wasn't just decoration. It was proof that she'd earned her place in the world through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. A knock at my door interrupted my thoughts. "Sarah?" Chloe's voice was tentative. "Can I come in?" "Of course." She entered wearing a perfectly tailored black dress that probably cost more than I made in a month, but her usual confidence was nowhere to be seen. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she'd slept about as well as I had. "You look official," she said, taking in my uniform. "I look like what I am," I replied, "a United States Army officer attending a fellow veteran's funeral." She perched on the edge of my bed, something she used to do when she was little and wanted to talk. "Sarah, I need to tell you something. About yesterday, when Mother caught us in Grandfather's study." "Chloe," Victoria's voice echoed down the hallway. "We need you downstairs. The florist is here." My sister's face went pale. "I have to go, but Sarah, please, be careful today. There are things you don't understand yet." She was gone before I could ask what she meant, leaving me with more questions and a growing sense of unease. Downstairs, the manor had been transformed into a stage for grief. Black draping covered the mirrors. White roses filled every available vase. and someone had set up a receiving line in the foyer where family members could accept condolences with appropriate solemnity. It was all very proper, very dignified, and completely devoid of anything that actually honored the man we were supposed to be mourning. Victoria stood at the center of it all, directing traffic like a general commanding troops. She'd changed from her breakfast attire into a Chanel suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, complete with a black hat that somehow managed to look both mournful and fashionable. Everything about her performance was perfect, except for the fact that she'd been married to grandfather for barely 15 years and had spent most of that time trying to change everything he'd built. "Sarah, there you are," she said when she spotted me. "You'll stand with the family during the receiving line, of course. Third position, after Marcus and Chloe." Third position, behind the stepchildren who'd known grandfather for less time than I'd been alive. The placement was deliberate, designed to send a message about my place in the family hierarchy. "Actually," I said, "I think I'll stand with the other veterans. Grandfather would have preferred that." Victoria's smile tightened. "This is a family occasion, not a military reunion." For Colonel Harrison Blackwood, those were the same thing. Before she could respond, a commotion near the front door drew our attention. A convoy of black sedans had pulled up the circular drive, disgorging men and women in military dress uniforms. The sight of them, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, standing at attention in the morning light, sent something fierce and proud through my chest. "Who invited them?" Victoria hissed. "Grandfather did," said a voice behind us. We turned to find James Morrison, grandfather's longtime lawyer and friend, approaching with a manila folder tucked under his arm. He was a small, precise man in his 60s who'd served as a Navy JAG officer before going into private practice. Colonel Blackwood left very specific instructions about his funeral arrangements: military honors, veteran honor guard, and full attendance by any active or retired personnel who wished to pay their respects. Victoria's face was a mask of controlled fury, but she couldn't argue with a dead man's wishes. Not publicly, anyway. The next hour was a blur of handshakes and murmured condolences. Politicians, business leaders, and old family friends filed past, each offering their sympathies and sharing memories of grandfather's contributions to the community. But it was the veterans who really mattered. They came in steady streams. Young soldiers who'd benefited from Blackwood Industries' veteran hiring programs, middle-aged officers who'd served with grandfather in various capacities, and elderly men who'd fought alongside him in Vietnam. Each one had a story about how grandfather had written recommendation letters, provided job opportunities, or simply listened when they needed someone who understood what service meant. These weren't political connections or business relationships. These were bonds forged in the understanding that some things matter more than money. "Your grandfather saved my life," said a grizzled Marine colonel who'd lost his left arm in Desert Storm, not in combat, afterward. "When I came home and couldn't find work, couldn't sleep, couldn't function, he gave me a job, gave me purpose. Told me that serving our country didn't end when we took off the uniform." Another veteran, a young woman about my age wearing army dress blues, approached with tears in her eyes. "Lieutenant Blackwood, I'm Captain Maria Santos. Your grandfather funded my scholarship through college after I was wounded in Iraq. When he heard I was having trouble with the VA, he personally made phone calls until they approved my disability claim. I wouldn't be here without him." Story after story, each one revealing a side of grandfather that his family either didn't know or didn't care about. The man who'd built a business empire wasn't just accumulating wealth. He was using it to honor the commitment he'd made when he first put on a uniform. I noticed Marcus and Victoria exchanging glances during these conversations, their expressions ranging from impatience to outright irritation. This wasn't the narrative they wanted told about Harrison Blackwood. They preferred the story of the successful businessman, the family patriarch, the man who'd built something for his heirs to inherit. The idea that he might have had higher loyalties, greater purposes, clearly made them uncomfortable. The funeral service itself was held in the manor's ballroom, which had been converted into a temporary chapel. 200 folding chairs faced a makeshift altar, where grandfather's flag-draped casket sat surrounded by flowers and military memorabilia. The American flag that covered the casket was the same one that had been presented to my grandmother when my great-uncle died in Korea. Grandfather had specifically requested it in his will. I sat in the front row between Chloe and Uncle Richard, directly across from Victoria and Marcus. The family section, according to protocol, though I noticed that several of the veterans had been seated in what should have been reserved areas. Someone, probably Morrison, had made sure that grandfather's real family was properly represented. The service began with military tradition. An honor guard presented colors, while a bugler played to the colors. The precision of their movements, the snap of the flags in the morning breeze, the haunting notes of the bugle, it all spoke to something deeper than civilian grief. This was how warriors said goodbye to one of their own. Father Mackenzie, the family priest, delivered the opening remarks with appropriate solemnity, but his words felt hollow and rehearsed. He spoke of grandfather's business success, his charitable contributions, his role as a family patriarch. All true, but missing the essential point. Then Morrison stepped to the podium. Harrison Blackwood asked me to speak today not as his lawyer but as his friend and fellow veteran, he began. He had specific things he wanted said, and I'm going to honor that request. Victoria shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Harrison served his country for 26 years, but he never stopped serving, Morrison continued. When he built Blackwood Industries, he didn't do it for personal glory or family legacy. He did it because he believed that the freedoms we fought for meant nothing if veterans came home to unemployment, homelessness, and indifference. He pulled out a piece of paper, handwritten notes in grandfather's distinctive script. These are his words, not mine. I've spent my life trying to bridge the gap between those who serve and those who benefit from that service. I've made mistakes, trusted the wrong people, and sometimes let business concerns override my principles. But I've never forgotten that my first duty was to the Constitution, my second to my fellow veterans, and my third to my family, in that order. The silence in the room was deafening. I could feel Victoria's rage radiating from across the aisle, could see Marcus's hands clenched in his lap. But the veterans in attendance, they understood. Duty, honor, country. Not just words, but a way of life. Morrison wasn't finished. Harrison wanted everyone to know that he considered his granddaughter Sarah to be the finest example of those principles in action. Her service in Afghanistan, her leadership under fire, her commitment to her soldiers. These things made him prouder than any business deal or financial success ever could. My throat tightened, and I felt Chloe reach over to squeeze my hand. He also wanted it known that Captain Michael Blackwood, Sarah's father, died a hero's death in service to his country, and that anyone who failed to honor that sacrifice was unworthy of the Blackwood name. The words hit like artillery rounds. Victoria's face had gone white, and Marcus looked like he'd been slapped. Around the room, heads turned toward our family section, and I could feel the weight of judgment from people who understood what Morrison was really saying. The rest of the service passed in a blur. Military hymns, readings from scripture, eulogies from business associates who clearly hadn't known grandfather nearly as well as they claimed. But the damage was done. Morrison had publicly declared where Harrison Blackwood's true loyalties lay, and it wasn't with the family that had spent years trying to erase his military identity. The graveside ceremony was equally powerful. The burial plot was in Arlington National Cemetery. Grandfather had earned that right through his service, and he'd specifically requested it over the family mausoleum, where generations of Blackwoods lay in expensive marble splendor. Here, surrounded by simple white headstones marking the graves of thousands of veterans, Colonel Harrison Blackwood was laid to rest among his true peers. The honor guard performed the flag-folding ceremony with practiced precision, each fold executed with the kind of attention to detail that only comes from understanding what the flag represents. When they finished, the senior NCO approached me, not Victoria, not Marcus, but me, and placed the folded flag in my hands. On behalf of the President of the United States and the United States Army, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your grandfather's honorable and faithful service to country. The weight of the flag in my hands was overwhelming. 13 folds, each one representing some aspect of the life we'd just celebrated. Liberty, unity, independence, justice, concepts that Harrison Blackwood had lived and died for, and that his family had never truly understood. The final moment came when the honor guard fired their 3-volley salute. 21 shots echoing across the cemetery, each one marking the end of a life devoted to service. Then taps, played by a lone bugler standing on a distant hill, the mournful notes carrying across the headstones like a prayer. I'd heard taps played at military funerals before, but this time it felt personal. This wasn't just any fallen soldier. This was my grandfather, the man who taught me that service meant sacrifice, that honor was more important than wealth, and that some things were worth dying for. As the last note faded into silence, I felt a presence beside me. A tall man in army dress blues with stars on his shoulders had approached without my noticing. 3 stars, a lieutenant general, one of the highest-ranking officers in the service. "Lieutenant Blackwood," he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of command. "I'm General Patterson. I served with your grandfather in Vietnam, and I wanted to pay my respects." I saluted, which he returned with the kind of precision that only comes from decades of practice. "Your grandfather spoke of you often," he continued. "Your leadership in Afghanistan, your Bronze Star action. He was extraordinarily proud. He also asked me to give you this when the time was right." He handed me a small velvet box. Inside was a medal I recognized but had never seen in person, the Distinguished Service Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor in recognizing extraordinary heroism. "This was his," General Patterson explained, "earned during the Tet Offensive when he held a firebase against overwhelming odds for 3 days until reinforcements arrived. He never talked about it publicly, preferred to let his actions speak for themselves. He wanted you to have it." My hands shook as I held the medal. The Distinguished Service Cross wasn't just decoration. It was proof of heroism under fire, of leadership when everything was falling apart, of the kind of courage that defined a soldier's character. "There's something else," the general said, lowering his voice. "Your grandfather was concerned about certain irregularities in his business affairs. He asked me to keep an eye on things. And I want you to know that if you need assistance, any kind of assistance, you can contact me directly." He handed me a card with his personal contact information, then stepped back and saluted again. "It was an honor to serve with Colonel Blackwood, and it's an honor to meet his granddaughter." As he walked away, I noticed that other veterans were approaching, a steady stream of officers and enlisted personnel who wanted to share their memories of grandfather or simply pay their respects to his family. Real family, the kind forged in shared sacrifice rather than shared DNA. But I also noticed that Victoria, Marcus, and most of the civilian attendees had already left. They'd stayed for the official ceremony, but this part, the part where veterans honored one of their own, apparently wasn't important enough for their time. Chloe had stayed, though. She stood beside me as the last of the veterans filed past, her face thoughtful and sad. "I never knew," she said quietly, "about grandfather's medal, about all the people he helped. Mother and Marcus never talked about any of that." "They never understood it," I replied. To them, his military service was just something he did before he became successful. They never realized it was the foundation of everything he built afterward. "Sarah, there's something I need to tell you," she said, glancing around to make sure we weren't being overheard. "About the will reading tomorrow. Mother and Marcus have been acting strange, like they know something I don't. And yesterday, when I tried to tell you something in grandfather's study." "What about it?" "I found something hidden in one of his books, a letter addressed to you." My heart stopped. "Where is it?" "I hid it in my room. Mother was watching everything so carefully, and after she locked the study, I was afraid to say anything. But Sarah, I think grandfather knew something was wrong. The letter, it talks about people he couldn't trust, about making sure the truth came out." Before I could respond, Morrison appeared beside us. "Ladies, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we need to head back to the manor. There are some documents that need to be reviewed before tomorrow's reading." Chloe shot me a meaningful look. "We'll talk tonight?" she whispered. The drive back to Blackwood Manor was tense and silent. Victoria and Marcus rode in the lead car with Morrison, while Chloe and I followed in a second vehicle. I used the time to process everything that had happened. The service, the veterans' stories, General Patterson's warning, and now the revelation that grandfather had left me a letter. "Chloe," I said as we pulled into the manor's circular drive, "whatever you found, we need to be careful. If there really is something wrong, if people can't be trusted, then we're dealing with more than family drama." She nodded, her face pale but determined. I know. But Sarah, grandfather trusted you with that medal, with his legacy. If he thought you needed to know something, then you deserve to know it. The afternoon and evening passed slowly. More visitors came to pay their respects, though the crowd was smaller and more intimate than the morning's gathering. Family friends, longtime employees, a few veterans who hadn't been able to make it to Arlington. I found myself gravitating toward the employees, people who'd worked for Blackwood Industries for decades and had stories about grandfather that painted him as a fair, demanding, but ultimately caring boss. He never forgot a name, said Eleanor Martinez, who'd been his executive assistant for 25 years. Didn't matter if you were the CEO or the night janitor, Colonel Blackwood knew who you were and what was important to you. When my son deployed to Iraq, he checked on him personally through his contacts in the Pentagon. He saved the company during the recession, added Robert Chen, the chief financial officer. Could have laid off half the workforce like everyone else was doing, but instead he took a personal loss to keep people employed. Said he wouldn't abandon the people who'd helped build what he had. These stories painted a picture of a man who understood leadership not as privilege, but as responsibility. Someone who'd never forgotten that power was meant to serve others, not oneself. But I also noticed things that didn't sit right. Conversations that stopped when I approached. Glances exchanged between Victoria and Marcus that seemed loaded with meaning. The way certain topics were avoided, certain questions deflected. And through it all, Morrison watched everything with the careful attention of someone who'd spent decades navigating complex legal situations. Every so often, I'd catch him looking at me with an expression that seemed almost expectant, like he was waiting for something to happen. As the evening wound down and the last visitors departed, the manor felt different, emptier, but also more tense. The performance was over, and now it was just family. Or what passed for family in this house. Well, Victoria said, settling into one of the living room's antique chairs with a glass of wine. That went well. Very dignified, very appropriate. Grandfather would have been pleased, Marcus added, though his tone suggested he hadn't particularly enjoyed the military aspects of the day. I thought about General Patterson's warning, about the Distinguished Service Cross weighing heavy in my jacket pocket, about the letter Chloe had hidden in her room. I think he would have been pleased that so many veterans came to honor him. Yes, well, Victoria waved her hand dismissively. Harrison always was sentimental about his military days. It's good that they showed up to pay their respects. The casual dismissal of grandfather's service, reducing 26 years of dedication to sentimental feelings, made something hot and angry rise in my chest. But I'd learned patience in the army. Sometimes the best strategy was to let your enemies reveal themselves. The will reading is tomorrow at 10, Morrison said, gathering his papers. I'll need everyone here promptly. There are some complex matters to discuss. Complex how? I asked. Morrison's eyes met mine. Your grandfather's final wishes were very specific. There are provisions that may surprise some people. Victoria and Marcus exchanged another of those loaded glances. I'm sure everything will be straightforward, Victoria said. Harrison was always very clear about his intentions. Yes, Morrison replied carefully. He was indeed. After Morrison left, the family dispersed quickly. Victoria and Marcus huddled in quiet conversation in the library, while Uncle Richard and Aunt Diane retired to their guest room. I helped Chloe clear away the remaining glasses and plates, waiting for our chance to talk privately. Finally, as the house settled into quiet, Chloe appeared at my bedroom door. She was carrying what looked like an old leather-bound book, and her expression was nervous but determined. This is it, she said, closing the door behind her and locking it. I found it yesterday morning, before the funeral preparations started. I was looking for something to read. You know how grandfather always said we should educate ourselves? And I noticed this book felt different. She opened the volume, Thucydides, History of the Peloponnesian War, and revealed that the pages had been carefully cut out to create a hidden compartment. Inside was a sealed envelope, with my name written in grandfather's distinctive handwriting. Sarah Elizabeth Blackwood, Lieutenant United States Army, I read aloud. To be opened only after my death, and only by her. My hands shook as I broke the seal. Inside were 3 sheets of paper covered in grandfather's careful script, dated just 6 months ago. "My dearest Sarah," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and certain truths can finally be told. I have spent the last years of my life trying to undo mistakes I made in trusting the wrong people with my legacy and your future." I looked up at Chloe, who was reading over my shoulder, her face pale. "There are those in this family who have forgotten that honor matters more than money, that duty comes before personal gain. They have made decisions that betray everything I spent my life building, and I fear they will continue to do so unless stopped." The letter went on to detail financial irregularities that grandfather had discovered, attempts to manipulate his will, and evidence of corruption in both the family trust and Blackwood Industries. But it was the final paragraph that made my blood run cold. "Sarah, you are the only person I trust to carry forward the values that have guided our family for generations. The will reading tomorrow will reveal the extent of my faith in you, but also the lengths to which others have gone to undermine that faith. Be prepared for betrayal, but know that you are not alone. James Morrison has instructions to assist you, and General Patterson will provide support if needed. The truth must come out, no matter the cost." Chloe and I sat in stunned silence for several minutes, processing the implications of what we'd just read. "Sarah," she whispered finally, "what does this mean? What financial irregularities? What manipulation?" I thought about Victoria's smugness, Marcus's certainty, the way they'd been acting like the will reading was just a formality. "I think it means tomorrow is going to be very interesting." As we prepared to hide the letter again, I noticed there was one more item in the book's hidden compartment, a small key with a number etched into it, 1847. "Safety deposit box," Chloe said immediately. "Grandfather always said that important things should be kept where they're protected." I pocketed the key, along with the letter. Whatever grandfather had hidden away, whatever evidence he'd gathered, tomorrow's will reading was going to reveal truths that some people clearly didn't want exposed. As Chloe slipped back to her room and I prepared for bed, I thought about the day's events. The funeral had been a powerful reminder of what Harrison Blackwood really stood for, but it had also revealed the fundamental divide in his family. On one side were those who understood that service and sacrifice created real value. On the other were those who saw only opportunity and inheritance. Tomorrow, I suspected, that divide was going to become a chasm. Outside my window, Blackwood Manor settled into darkness, but I had the feeling that the real battle was just beginning. Whatever secrets grandfather had uncovered, whatever betrayals he'd discovered, the will reading would force everything into the light. And as a soldier who'd learned to trust her instincts in combat, I knew that sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones who share your name. The morning of the will reading dawned crisp and clear, a stark contrast to the stormy weather that had dominated the previous days. I stood at my bedroom window, watching the sunrise paint the Virginia countryside in shades of gold and amber, trying to calm the nervous energy that had kept me awake most of the night. In a few hours, whatever grandfather had planned would finally be revealed, and based on his hidden letter, it was going to change everything. I'd been up since 0430, following my usual military routine. Physical training, shower, breakfast, and mental preparation for what promised to be a challenging day. The Distinguished Service Cross sat on my dresser, catching the morning light, a tangible reminder of the legacy I was supposed to carry forward. The safety deposit box key felt heavy in my pocket, along with grandfather's letter that I'd read at least a dozen times, memorizing every word. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. "Sarah, it's me." Chloe's voice was barely above a whisper. I unlocked the door to find my half-sister looking pale and nervous, still in her pajamas despite the late hour. "I couldn't sleep either," she said, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. "I keep thinking about what grandfather wrote, about the financial irregularities and betrayal. What if Mother and Marcus have been stealing from the company? What if they've been planning this for years?" "Then we'll deal with it," I said, adjusting my dress blues one final time. "Whatever happens today, we'll face it together." Chloe nodded, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She'd grown up in this house, under Victoria's influence, believing that family loyalty meant protecting the family's secrets. Now she was learning that sometimes family loyalty meant exposing those secrets to protect what really mattered. Sarah, there's something else, she said hesitantly. Last night, after you went to bed, I heard Mother and Marcus talking in the library. They were discussing something about damage control and, quote, alternative plans. Marcus said something about how the little soldier wouldn't know what hit her. My jaw tightened. Whatever they were planning, they clearly didn't expect me to put up much of a fight. They still saw me as the angry teenager who'd left 8 years ago, not the combat veteran who'd learned to think strategically under pressure. Did they say anything specific? I asked. Mother mentioned something about questioning mental capacity and undue influence. And Marcus said he had documentation that would support their position. Chloe's voice dropped even lower. Sarah, I think they're going to try to challenge whatever grandfather left you. They're going to claim he wasn't in his right mind, or that someone manipulated him. I thought about Morrison's careful words yesterday about General Patterson's warning, about the letter hidden in Thucydides. Grandfather had anticipated this. He'd known exactly what kind of people he was dealing with, and he'd prepared accordingly. Let them try, I said. We have his letter, and we have that key. Whatever evidence he gathered, whatever proof he left behind, it's going to tell the real story. Downstairs, the manor felt different this morning. The funeral decorations had been removed overnight, replaced by the normal grandeur that Victoria preferred. It was as if she was already erasing the last traces of yesterday's military honors, returning the house to her vision of what the Blackwood legacy should represent. Victoria herself was in full armor, a severe black suit, her hair pulled back in a style that emphasized the sharp angles of her face, diamond earrings that caught the light like weapons. She sat at the breakfast table with a cup of coffee and a stack of legal documents, studying them with the intensity of a general reviewing battle plans. Marcus emerged from the library looking slightly hungover but determined. He'd clearly been drinking late into the night, probably working up the courage for whatever confrontation they had planned. Uncle Richard and Aunt Diane sat quietly at one end of the table, picking at their food and avoiding eye contact with anyone. Good morning, Sarah, Victoria said without looking up from her papers. I trust you slept well? Today is going to be quite educational. The threat in her voice was barely concealed. Whatever they thought they knew, whatever they had planned, they were confident it would destroy any hopes I might have had about grandfather's will. I slept fine, I replied, pouring myself a cup of coffee, looking forward to hearing grandfather's final wishes. Marcus snorted. I'm sure you are, though I suspect you might be disappointed. Why would I be disappointed? He exchanged a meaningful glance with Victoria. Let's just say that grandfather's mental state in his final months was questionable. There's documented evidence of confusion, poor judgment, susceptibility to outside influence. My hand tightened on my coffee cup, but I kept my voice level. Documented by whom? His physician, his caretakers, family members who were actually present during his decline, Victoria said smoothly. Unlike some people who were too busy playing soldier to visit their dying grandfather. The accusation hit like a physical blow, but I'd learned not to react to emotional manipulation. I requested leave multiple times to visit him. I was told he wasn't receiving visitors. Told by whom? Marcus challenged. I looked directly at Victoria. By your assistant, who said she was following Mrs. Blackwood's instructions. The silence that followed was loaded with implication. Chloe was staring at her plate, but I could see her hands shaking slightly. Uncle Richard cleared his throat uncomfortably. Well, Victoria said finally, I'm sure there were misunderstandings. The important thing is that Harrison made his final decisions based on the information he had at the time. What decisions? I asked. You'll find out soon enough, Marcus said with a smirk that made me want to wipe it off his face. Morrison arrived promptly at 10 a.m., carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the same serious expression he'd worn at the funeral. Behind him came 2 other men, one I recognized as Harrison's longtime accountant, Thomas Webb, and another who introduced himself as David Kim, a partner at Morrison's law firm. Good morning, everyone, Morrison said, settling at the head of the dining room table where Victoria had arranged chairs for the family. Thank you all for being prompt. Before we begin, I need to inform you that Colonel Blackwood left very specific instructions about how this reading should be conducted. He opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder, along with what appeared to be a sealed envelope. First, he requested that Lieutenant Sarah Blackwood be present for the entire reading. regardless of any objections from other family members. Second, he insisted that the contents of his will not be discussed or questioned until the complete document has been read. And third, he arranged for independent witnesses to verify that his final wishes are carried out exactly as written. Victoria's smile was razor-sharp. Of course, James. We all want to honor Harrison's wishes. Though I should mention that we have some concerns about the circumstances under which certain amendments to the will were made. What kind of concerns? Morrison asked, though his tone suggested he already knew what was coming. Marcus leaned forward, clearly enjoying himself. Concerns about grandfather's mental capacity during his final months. We have documentation from Dr. Reynolds about his confusion, memory loss, and susceptibility to manipulation. He slid a folder across the table to Morrison, who opened it and scanned the contents with professional detachment. I see, Morrison said finally. Dr. Reynolds' notes indicate some concern about Colonel Blackwood's judgment in his final weeks. My heart sank. Were they right? Had grandfather been confused? Manipulated? Had whatever he'd planned been the product of a failing mind rather than careful strategy? Morrison continued. However, I should point out that these notes are dated after Colonel Blackwood's final will was executed. The document we're reading today was signed 6 months ago, when Dr. Reynolds' own records show that the colonel was fully competent. Victoria's smile faltered slightly. Furthermore, Morrison continued, Colonel Blackwood anticipated these exact concerns. That's why he arranged for independent medical and psychological evaluations to be conducted when the final will was signed. Those evaluations, conducted by 3 separate physicians, all confirmed his complete mental competency. He produced another folder, this one significantly thicker than Marcus's documentation. But most importantly, Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, Colonel Blackwood arranged for this will reading to be recorded and witnessed by federal authorities, specifically to prevent any claims of undue influence or mental incompetency. As if summoned by his words, the dining room door opened, and 3 people entered. The first was a woman in a business suit who introduced herself as Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh. The second was a court stenographer who immediately began setting up recording equipment. The third person made everyone in the room freeze. General Patterson stood in the doorway, his 3 stars gleaming on his dress uniform, his presence commanding instant respect and attention. But he wasn't alone. Behind him stood another figure that made my breath catch in my throat. A woman in army dress blues, with the eagles of a full colonel on her shoulders and a chest full of ribbons that told the story of a distinguished career. She was in her late 50s, with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. But it was her face that made my world tilt off its axis. She looked exactly like the photograph on my nightstand, the one of my father in his marine dress blues. Ladies and gentlemen, General Patterson said, I'd like you to meet Colonel Rebecca Blackwood, United States Army. She's here at the specific request of the late Colonel Harrison Blackwood. The silence in the room was deafening. Victoria had gone completely white, while Marcus looked like he'd seen a ghost. Uncle Richard was staring at the woman with his mouth open, and Aunt Diane had actually dropped her coffee cup. But it was Chloe who broke the silence. Aunt Rebecca, she whispered, but you're supposed to be dead. Colonel Rebecca Blackwood stepped forward, her bearing every inch the professional soldier. I'm very much alive, sweetheart, though certain people have spent the last 25 years pretending otherwise. Her eyes swept the room, taking in each face with military precision before settling on me. Hello, Sarah. I'm your father's sister, your aunt. And I have some things to tell you about your family that they really don't want you to know. Morrison cleared his throat. If everyone could please take their seats, we'll begin the reading. Colonel Blackwood requested that Rebecca be present for this, and that her identity be revealed at this specific moment. As we settled around the table, though Victoria and Marcus looked like they'd rather bolt from the room, Morrison opened the sealed envelope and withdrew a document that was considerably thicker than anyone had expected. The last will and testament of Colonel Harrison James Blackwood, United States Army, retired, he began. Dated 6 months ago and executed in the presence of 3 witnesses, including General Patterson and Colonel Rebecca Blackwood. Victoria shot to her feet. This is impossible. Rebecca Blackwood died in a training accident 25 years ago. We have the death certificate. You have a falsified death certificate, Rebecca said calmly. Created to cover up the fact that I was deep undercover for Army intelligence, investigating defense contractor fraud, including fraud involving Blackwood Industries. The words hit the room like artillery shells. Marcus was gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles had turned white, while Victoria looked like she was about to have a stroke. Shall I continue? Morrison asked, though it wasn't really a question. He began reading from the will, and with each paragraph, the magnitude of grandfather's final strategy became clear. This wasn't just about inheritance. It was about justice. To my beloved granddaughter, First Lieutenant Sarah Elizabeth Blackwood, United States Army, I leave the entirety of my personal estate, including Blackwood Manor and all associated properties, valued at approximately $50 million. Victoria gasped, but Morrison continued without pause. I also leave to Sarah my complete ownership stake in Blackwood Industries, consisting of 68% of all shares, making her the majority owner and CEO of the company. Marcus shot to his feet. That's impossible. The company shares were supposed to be divided among the family. Please let me finish, Morrison said firmly. To my stepdaughter Victoria Blackwood, I leave the sum of $1 million, contingent upon her cooperation with federal investigations into financial irregularities at Blackwood Industries. Victoria's face had gone from white to bright red. Financial irregularities? What financial irregularities? Morrison looked up from the will. The ones that your late husband documented extensively over the past 2 years, including the embezzlement of veteran support funds, the manipulation of defense contracts, and the systematic theft of assets intended for charitable purposes. He produced another folder, this one marked with federal seals. Colonel Blackwood spent his final months working with the FBI, the IRS, and Army intelligence to build a comprehensive case against the people who betrayed his trust and stole from the programs he created to help veterans. Rebecca stepped forward. My investigation, which has been ongoing for 5 years, has documented the theft of over $40 million from veteran support programs, fraudulent billing on defense contracts, and the use of Blackwood Industries resources to fund personal expenses and offshore accounts. The room erupted in chaos. Victoria was screaming about lies and conspiracies, Marcus was demanding to see evidence, and Uncle Richard looked like he was having a heart attack. But I sat in stunned silence, trying to process what I was hearing. Grandfather hadn't just left me an inheritance. He'd left me a mission. The restoration of everything that had been stolen, the protection of everything he'd built to help veterans, and the responsibility to carry forward the values that had guided his life. Morrison's voice cut through the chaos. Marcus Blackwood, you are hereby notified that you are under federal investigation for embezzlement, wire fraud, and violation of the False Claims Act. Victoria Blackwood, you are similarly under investigation for conspiracy and money laundering. Assistant U.S. Attorney Walsh stepped forward with official documents. We have warrants for the immediate seizure of all financial records, personal assets purchased with embezzled funds, and offshore accounts linked to this conspiracy. As federal agents began entering the dining room, Victoria turned on me with pure hatred in her eyes. You think you've won something? You have no idea how to run a company. You're just a soldier playing dress-up. Before I could respond, General Patterson stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades in command. Mrs. Blackwood, you are addressing Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Blackwood, United States Army. The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Everyone turned to stare at me in confusion, including me. Sir? I managed to say. General Patterson smiled for the first time since I'd met him. Your promotion came through this morning, along with your new assignment. You're being transferred to the Pentagon, where you'll be working on veteran support programs and defense contractor oversight. Your grandfather recommended you for the position 6 months ago, and your service record speaks for itself. He stepped closer, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood has commanded troops in combat, earned the Bronze Star for valor, and demonstrated the kind of leadership this country needs. She's exactly the person Colonel Harrison Blackwood knew she was, a soldier worthy of carrying forward his legacy. As he spoke, Rebecca moved to stand beside me, her hand resting on my shoulder. The gesture was simple, but it connected me to a family I'd never known I had, to a legacy that went beyond money and property. Morrison continued reading from the will. I name my granddaughter Sarah as the executor of my estate and the guardian of my true legacy, the programs and foundations created to serve those who have served our country. I entrust her with the responsibility of ensuring that Blackwood Industries returns to its founding principles, that those who profit from freedom must never forget the price that freedom demands. The final paragraphs of the will outlined the establishment of new foundations, scholarship programs, and veteran support initiatives, all funded by the recovered assets and future company profits. It was a comprehensive plan to transform Blackwood Industries from a family business into a force for supporting military families and veterans. As the federal agents led Victoria and Marcus away in handcuffs, their schemes finally exposed, their theft documented, their betrayal complete, I found myself alone with Rebecca, Morrison, and General Patterson. There's more, Rebecca said quietly, producing an envelope with my name on it. This is from your father. He wrote it before his final deployment, asking me to give it to you when you were old enough to understand. With shaking hands, I opened the letter. My father's handwriting was bold and confident, filling 2 pages with words I'd waited my entire life to read. My dearest daughter, it began. If you're reading this, then I didn't come home from this war. But I want you to know that serving our country, protecting the freedoms we all cherish, is the highest honor a person can have. And I want you to know that whatever path you choose in life, as long as you choose it with honor and courage, I will be proud of you. The letter went on to talk about duty, sacrifice, and the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. But it was the final paragraph that brought tears to my eyes. Remember that being a Blackwood means more than sharing a name. It means understanding that we serve something greater than ourselves. Your grandfather knows this, your Aunt Rebecca knows this, and I believe you will know this too. Take care of our family's honor, sweetheart. It's the only inheritance that really matters. As I finished reading, I looked around the dining room where everything had changed in the span of 2 hours. The family I'd grown up with was revealed as thieves and fraudsters. The company I was supposed to inherit was built on theft from the very people it was supposed to serve. But I'd also discovered family I'd never known existed, a legacy worth preserving, and a mission that gave meaning to everything I'd experienced. General Patterson approached with a final document. Lieutenant Colonel, this is your new assignment order. You'll have 30 days to transition Blackwood Industries to new management and establish the oversight structures your grandfather envisioned. After that, you'll report to the Pentagon to help develop new programs for veteran support and defense contractor accountability. I looked at the orders, then at Rebecca, who was smiling with pride. Aunt Rebecca, will you help me? I have no idea how to run a billion-dollar company. She laughed, the sound warm and genuine. Sweetheart, I've been preparing for this moment for 5 years. Your grandfather and I planned every detail, anticipated every obstacle. We're going to transform this company into exactly what it was always supposed to be, a way to serve those who've served us. 6 months later, I stood in the same dining room, but everything was different. The walls now displayed photographs of veterans, scholarship recipients, and families helped by the new Blackwood Foundation. The company had been restructured, with independent oversight and transparent accounting. The stolen money had been recovered and returned to veteran support programs. Victoria and Marcus were serving federal prison sentences for their crimes. Uncle Richard had cooperated with investigators and received probation, while Aunt Diane had filed for divorce and moved to Florida. Chloe had taken a position with the foundation, using her education and natural compassion to help develop new programs for military families. But it was the phone call I'd received that morning that made everything complete. Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood, the voice had said, "This is Captain Maria Santos. You might remember me from your grandfather's funeral. I wanted to let you know that the scholarship program you've established just funded my master's degree in social work. I'm going to be working with veteran families, helping them navigate the transition to civilian life." Stories like that came in every day now. Veterans finding jobs through Blackwood Industries hiring programs. Military families receiving scholarships for their children's education. Wounded warriors getting the support they needed to rebuild their lives. This was the legacy grandfather had really left me, not money or property, but the opportunity to serve something greater than myself. The chance to honor the sacrifice of every person who'd ever worn the uniform, including my father. As I sat at my desk, reviewing plans for the next phase of foundation programs, Rebecca knocked on the door. "Ready for the board meeting?" she asked. I looked out the window at the American flag flying over Blackwood Manor, then at the photograph on my desk. Grandfather, my father, and now Rebecca and me, all in uniform, all part of something that mattered. "Ready," I said, straightening my shoulders with the confidence of someone who'd finally found her place in the world. The boardroom was filled with new faces, veterans, business leaders committed to ethical practices, and foundation directors who understood that success was measured not in profit margins, but in lives changed. At the head of the table sat the framed copy of Grandfather's final letter to me, the one that had started it all. "You are the only person I trust to carry forward the values that have guided our family for generations." As I called the meeting to order, I thought about that first day when I'd walked into this house as an unwelcome guest at my grandfather's funeral. I'd been Lieutenant Sarah Blackwood then, an outsider looking in, fighting for respect from people who'd never understood what service meant. Now I was Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Blackwood, CEO of Blackwood Industries, guardian of a legacy built on honor rather than greed, and leader of programs that were making a real difference in the lives of people who'd given everything for their country. When that three-star general had walked into the courtroom, or in this case, the dining room, and called me by my rank, he hadn't just been recognizing my military service. He'd been acknowledging that I'd finally become the person my grandfather always knew I could be. The family that had rejected me was gone, replaced by something far more valuable. A chosen family of people who understood that true inheritance isn't what you're given, but what you give back. And as I looked around the table at faces filled with purpose and determination, I knew that Colonel Harrison Blackwood's mission was in good hands. The meeting began with Rebecca's report on the latest veteran support initiatives, and I smiled as I listened to the numbers, not of profits, but of lives changed, families helped, futures restored. This was what victory looked like. Not the destruction of enemies, but the building of something worthy of the sacrifice others had made. Outside the window, storm clouds were gathering again, but inside Blackwood Manor, the mission continued. Some legacies are measured in dollars. Others are measured in the lives they touch and the honor they preserve. I knew which kind mattered more.